You're watching an NDTV special focus. As the war rages in Ukraine, questions over how it's going to play itself out and what it means for the world order. Who better to answer that than Fareed Zakaria? He's a Washington Post columnist, he's an author and a broadcaster and a foremost commentator on world affairs, and he joins me from America. Thank you very much indeed, Fareed Zakaria, for joining us. Let me just start first with a kind of big picture, broad brush question when we look at what has happened today. At today's escalation, where Russian forces attacked a Ukrainian nuclear plant, almost created a kind of doomsday scenario, things are not going well.
I think that's exactly right. Clearly, things are not going according to the Russian plan. We know this because the Russians planned on a lightning strike that would get them to Kyiv, that would allow them to take control. Presumably, they hoped that the army would depose the president. This is what Putin called for, that the people would rise up and support it. None of this happened. The army that was sent in initially had very, very few supplies. And so now they are trying to resupply the armies. They were trying to take control of the key military centers, the air base outside of Kyiv, so that they could then start landing Russian troops there. Instead, what has happened is a much slower grinding operation where they are basically getting more and more brutal. They are inflicting more and more civilian casualties, and they are trying to take control of whatever they can. There is no particular strategic purpose to taking control of that nuclear power plant. It is just a power plant. But what it shows you is that the Russian army is now trying to take what it can get, not what it wanted to get. What it should be trying to take, first of all, it should have focused entirely on Kyiv and the airport around it, the key transport networks. So the whole thing is not going well at all for Putin. But that makes it more worrying because the Russians, remember in Chechnya, the Russians killed 250,000 people. They leveled Grozny, an ancient city, almost to the ground. So far, they have not been quite that brutal. They haven't used their air force. But Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons implicitly, and he has escalated his demands. So he feels like a man somewhat cornered and therefore doubling down.
Right. I actually want to get into multiple scenarios with you in just a second. But before that, let me just ask you, though, a couple of questions. One of which is what this means when it comes to the world order. But before that, I wanted to ask you about how he can be stopped. Because at the moment, what we're seeing is that NATO countries are very clear that they don't want to get into that war, and understandably so. They don't want to enforce a no-fly zone, as Ukraine has been asking, but they're trying to do it through the route of sanctions. Now, you are amongst many who pointed out that sanctions generally don't work. Tell us a little bit about that. Has there been anywhere in history where economic sanctions have worked? And if they are to work in this case, what needs to be done?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have a fairly long track record with sanctions. There have been many efforts to do it, going back to the ancient times with sieges and stuff. And the fundamental problem is this: if a country believes that its core interests are involved, and Putin clearly has this kind of nationalist vision of uniting all the Russian-speaking people, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, perhaps people in Georgia. This is a fundamentally nationalist, somewhat irrational project that is not about cost-benefit calculations. And Putin doesn't suffer many of the costs of sanctions. We've seen this before. Castro did not suffer the costs of the sanctions placed on Cuba. He lived like a king. The Iranian regime lives in gilded cages, even though their people starve. So you're never able to quite penetrate through. Now, there are a few cases where it does seem to have worked. South Africa with apartheid. There were other things going on, but the sanctions clearly hurt. Iran with its nuclear program, which is why they signed on to the deal. What were the characteristics? It really has to be comprehensive. It really has to feel like the country is being completely cut off from revenue sources. only way to do that with Russia is to attack the goose that lays the golden egg. That is their oil revenues, their natural gas revenues.
Right.
If Russia is fundamentally a petrostate, that's really the source of its wealth. If you do not sanction that, I think you are fundamentally not going to be able to do it. And I've argued that the one advantage the United States and other countries in this coalition have is that there is a great deal of non-Russian energy supply that can be brought to the market. The United States is the largest producer of liquid hydrocarbons in the world. Venezuelan oil is off market because of Trump's sanctions. Those could be suspended. Iranian oil is off market because of sanctions. Those could be suspended. If the Iran deal is, they're close to renewing the Iran deal, that would bring it back. Saudis have spare capacity. The UAE has spare capacity. Canada has spare capacity. Mm-hmm. So if you were to really approach it in a concerted way, you could cut the Russians off or massively diminish the supply while replacing it on the markets. It feels to me, without that, sanctions are going to be something that hurt the Russian people. Yes, they will affect Putin and they will constrain him a bit, but they're not going to stop him.
Right. Okay, that's an important point which I wanted to get you to just talk a little bit more about, because the perception is that, and a lot of the analysis says this, that one of the reasons why Russia has not been heavily sanctioned when it comes to energy, its bits and pieces, is because Russia supplies a large chunk of energy, particularly to Europe, and that there aren't easily enough available cheap alternatives, which is why heavy sanctions of oil and gas on Russia will actually end up hurting particularly European economies.
Look, I think that there's truth to that. The Europeans get natural gas. That's not as easy to supply as oil. It's not as fungible. It's not as portable. And there will be probably some cost involved in doing it. Getting those LNG supplies to Europe will take time. But, 40 years from now, people will write about what is going on this week and what is going on with the disruption, with the effort of an aggressive dictator to really tear up the international order, to tear up the rules of the road, to tear up the international framework that has governed international relations since 1945. They will not remember whether energy prices in Germany went up 10 or 15%. They will not remember whether, the Germans had to scramble and for a few months find other sources. We have to put this in the context of the stakes here. And this is something I think is very important for people in India and around the world to understand. We have lived in a world in which these kind of acts were really unthinkable. And since 1945, there are very few cases, vanishingly small, of countries simply walking into their neighbors' land and annexing it, appropriating it, conquering it. It used to happen all the time. If you go before 1945, for the previous 100 years, it happened every couple of years.
Right.
But we have created a system that is much more orderly, much more peaceful. To have one of the world's superpowers, the largest nuclear-armed power in the world, tear up that rule book, the stakes could not be higher.
Okay. But tell us a little bit more about this changing world order and why we have come to this, because again, and this has been the subject of a lot of analysis, that many people are seeing this as an indication that America is no longer the global supercop. It is internally divided, and in any case, this is no longer a kind of unipolar world. There are multiple power centers that are emerging. There's America, there's Russia, there's China, and that's one of the reasons why Russia is able to do this. Would you agree that this kind of marks the end of that era, or whether that era even existed, of a certain kind of American supremacy?
Yeah, I've written about that myself. I wrote a book called The Post-American World, predicting exactly this.
Right.
Look, it's happening for a variety of reasons. One is it's not even the waning of American power. It's the waning of American will to uphold that power. The U.S. is still about a quarter of the world's economy. It is still, the larger militarily, in military terms, of the next 5 countries put together. But the United States, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, I think there is a certain exhaustion that has set in, which is reflected in the policy. The rise of India, China, all that puts further constraints. The reality of the financial crisis and the strains of American democracy that you were talking about, that also puts a strain. But it's worth noting, all those have been features that have, created a new environment. But the principal spoiler in the international system for a decade now has been a re-imperialized Russia. Think about it. Russia is the world's great geopolitical spoiler state at this point. It invaded Georgia. It annexed 2 parts of Georgia. It invaded Ukraine. It annexed Crimea. It created a de facto annexation in the east of Crimea. The Russian government sends out its agents to kill Russian dissidents, whether they are in Germany, whether they are in England. It uses cyber warfare to attack Western countries and some others. It interfered in the American elections, how extensively we can debate. The point is, there are very few other countries that do things like this. I mean, China does not. Obviously, India does not. This is a unusual, aggressive, re-imperialized Russia with a man whose vision, as I say, is to unite all the Russian-speaking people who happen to live in many countries that lie outside of Russia's borders.
But, Fareed Zakaria, when that argument is made, there is a counter view of people who say that, look, why is America not seen in the same light? America might not be invading or sending forces into its neighbors, but it's certainly doing that in the Middle East and beyond. And how is that different? And B, how does America then get off giving lectures about Russian aggression? Where does it still have that moral authority?
Yeah, look, it's a fair point. I've made it myself that one of the things the United States has to be careful is, as the upholder of the international order, to make sure that it also lives by it. And I've argued, for example, that the United States should join the International Court of Justice, for example, things like that. But, I think it takes a certain kind of moral obtuseness or moral blindness not to see the difference between a United States that, invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban government, one of the most repressive governments in the history of the world, and one that was sheltering Al-Qaeda and sheltering Pakistani and Afghan terrorists, versus a Russian invasion, which is an attempt to annex a part of its neighbor and in some way or the other subjugate that country to its control. I do not dispute that the United States has made mistakes. It has, intervened militarily in ways that have had civilian casualties. All those things are terrible. But again, it takes a certain moral obtuseness not to see the difference between what Russia is doing intentionally, determinedly, to really create a new Russian empire, and what the United States was doing, perhaps misguidedly, perhaps, with a degree of callousness that is unfortunate. And many of those operations, by the way, like the Libyan operation, like the Afghan operation, was sanctioned under international law, approved by the UN. In the case of the Libyan mission, requested by the Arab League.
Okay, I wish there was time to get into more of this with you, but we'll have you back. But let me ask you about India, because again, speaking to the point about the fact that the waning of sort of American global influence, that you have countries like India, a very close US ally, now taking this kind of balancing act position, refusing to outright condemn Russia, refusing to vote against Russia in the UN, abstaining on a number of occasions. We know, of course, about its old historical continuing links with the Soviet Union. But what do you make of India's position? Do you think this is a pragmatic view, or has it somewhat diminished India's standing in the global landscape?
Look, I understand India's quandary, and this places it in a great strategic quandary. India gets really most of its sophisticated military hardware from Russia. As somebody who's been arguing for 20 years that India should really rethink that strategic orientation, that it has been ever since the Bush administration, the United States has offered a new strategic orientation for India, including defense cooperation, including arms sales. And you have in India, for a combination of reasons, partly a kind of, nostalgia and ties to the old Russian relationship, a certain degree of nostalgia for kind of non-alignment policy, which was never non-aligned, really. It was always pro-Soviet. For all these kinds of reasons, there's a certain suspicion in the BJP of westernization and all that kind of thing. India has not moved with the kind of strategic purpose that I think would make sense. So I don't criticize India for what it's doing this week. It's trying a pragmatic balancing of its interests. But the real question it should trigger is, in a region, in a world for India, in which the principal challenge it faces for the next several decades, if not for the next century, is the rise of China. Should India be totally reliant for military hardware on China's greatest ally? To me, that seems to be a mismatch between India's national interests, its national objectives, and its national strategy.
Okay. As we wind down, let me run you through 5 scenarios. This is it's inspired or borrowed from something that the BBC had put out. And let me just quickly get your take on what you think is the most likely. Scenario number 1, a short war. Russia escalates aggression, takes over Ukraine. President Zelensky is either assassinated or he flees. And Russia ends up facing some kind of prolonged Ukrainian insurgency. Scenario 2, a long war. The Russian invasion drags into months. They struggle to maintain control and they eventually leave Ukraine bloodied, somewhat similar to the Afghan experience. Scenario 3, the war spills into Europe. Russia sees the supply of arms, Western arms to Ukraine as an act of aggression. They perhaps enter NATO territories, and then you get into the risk of nuclear war. Scenario 4, a diplomatic solution, fearing a backlash. Putin agrees to talk. Ukraine accepts Russian sovereignty over Russian-controlled areas. Putin accepts Ukraine independence. It's sort of pro-European tilt. Last scenario, Putin is ousted. As the deaths mount, there's an uprising against him. I can see you're smiling already. The West says to Russia, we'll withdraw sanctions if Putin goes, and he's ousted in a palace coup. Everyone lives happily ever after. So you could have other scenarios, or there could be but anyway, over to you.
Well, it's a very comprehensive list, and very well done.
BBC.
Look, the hope of parties that enter into military conflicts is always a clean, decisive victory. It very rarely happens. Think of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Think of the Indo-Pak wars with the territories like Kashmir left in this kind of gray zone.
Right.
I think most likely is therefore the one you place as scenario 4, which is some kind of a less than perfect military solution for both sides, which then forces diplomacy, forces talks. Most wars end in that way. Clausewitz, the great Prussian strategist, said, war is a continuation of politics by other means.
Yes.
And so in a sense, what happens is at the end of the war, the politics reemerges and you start talking. I would hope that that's where we go. And I hope that what I'm advocating is that you put enough pressure on Putin and you cut off enough of his revenues that he feels real pressure to make some compromises. To be fair to the Ukrainians, they have talked about compromising from the start.
Right.
Zelensky has talked about, things like a neutral status. He has said maybe NATO membership was just a dream of Ukraine's, but will not be a reality. It's Putin who remains utterly intransigent, whose demands have escalated, who talks in, it's extraordinary, talks in crazy terms about Zelensky as being a neo-Nazi and a drug dealer and things like that, which makes it, you wonder, is he really going to negotiate with this man? Is he going to compromise with him? So that still seems to be the blockage. But if one had to predict, and I just do this on the basis that most wars end in some imperfect brokered solution.
Okay. Well, let's hope that it's actually scenario 4, because that's the best case scenario for everybody, for the world and for Ukraine and Russia. But it is, of course, at an inflection point. So fingers crossed. But anyway, it's always a pleasure talking to you, Fareed Zakaria. Thank you so much for being on NDTV. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.